So hello, everyone. Um, I just want to remind everyone, because this question always comes up, we will be sending out a recording of this webinar to registered attendees. So you will get that in your email. So be prepared for that. And I wanted to introduce myself. So I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Molly Cohen-D'Agostino. I direct the Three Revolutions Policy Initiative here at UC Davis. Well, obviously not here in my home, but at UC Davis, and which is co-hosted by the Policy Institute of Energy, Environment, and the Economy and the Institute of Transportation Studies. Before we dive into our third in our series of webinars aimed to replace our canceled Three Revolutions Policy Conference, I wanted to pique your intrigue and announce our next iteration of the series. On July 15th at 1 p.m., we will be having an upcoming webinar reporting on the findings from a large data collection effort from my colleague Giovanni Churchella and his team at our Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program. His research is a combination of quantitative and qualitative data, a number of surveys, and also in-depth phone interviews to assess how communities are responding to the pandemic. This includes shifts in household organization, work activities, e-shopping, delivery, and the list goes on. So it should be a very interesting webinar to get some insights from that research project. Also, because that research project is such a big data collection effort, it is relevant to the work, the issues that we'll be discussing today, and hopefully our discussion here can inform that work as well. Yes, and Giovanni will be joined by Lisa Snap, Director of the Climate Analysis and Strategies Division of the U.S. EPA, as well as Dan Sperling, Founding Director of ITS Davis. Without further ado, I will introduce our speakers for today's webinar. I'm really thrilled to be joined by Regina Clewlow, CEO and co-founder of Populus, a data platform for cities to manage the future of mobility. Regina has over a decade of experience in transportation, having served as a research scientist and lecturer at Stanford, UC Berkeley, and UC Davis. And Regina was the Director of Business Development and Strategy at Ride Scout and Early Mobility as a Service Aggregator, and she has a PhD in Transportation and Energy Systems from MIT. Welcome, Regina.
Great to be here.
And our next speaker is Warren Logan. He serves as the Policy Director of Mobility and Interagency Relations for the Mayor's Office of Oakland. He is responsible for advancing the city's vision for safe and sustainable transportation for all Oaklanders by working with Oakland's departments and coordinating county and regional policy initiatives. Prior to the Mayor's Office, Warren was a senior planner at the SFCTA, the San Francisco County Transportation Authority, working on emerging mobility policy. And Warren has a master's in city and regional planning from UC Berkeley. So welcome, Warren. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
And I'll also introduce Juan Matute, is the Deputy Director of our sister institute at the Institute of Transportation Studies at UCLA. Juan manages the center's operations, external relations, research, and the student programs. And he also somehow fits in time to lecture in urban planning and serve as the chair of the Downtown Santa Monica Access, Mobility, and Parking Committee, and a couple other LA county and city volunteer opportunities too. So he manages to walk the walk and really practice what he preaches out in the community. So he also recently published a relevant article for the topic of today's talk titled Sharing Mobility Data for Planning and Policy Research, which he graciously invited me to help with, and we were co-authors, me and my colleague Austin Brown. And Juan also holds an MBA and Urban Planning MA from UCLA. So welcome, Juan. And our final speaker is Adonia Lugo. She chairs the Urban Sustainability Department at Antioch University in Los Angeles. Adonia is a cultural anthropologist, organizer, and academic liaison. And from 2013 to 2015, she ran the Equity Initiative at the US's oldest bicycle advocacy organization, the League of American Bicyclists. And then since 2016, she's also worked on this project called the Untokening, articulating the concept of mobility justice. And I really do encourage you to check out the Untokening. They have some fantastic webinars that could be a nice complement to this one, and also if you haven't already. And since then, she wrote a book in 2018 called Bicycle and Race, Transportation Culture and Resistance. So welcome, Adonia. So without further ado, we will get started. And I wanted to begin by, taking a somber moment to acknowledge this is a really tough time. And I want to acknowledge that transportation research and planning has a role to play in sort of they have racist and classist underpinnings. And rooted in the fact that the current transportation system was made for cars and for profit and not for people, and especially not for Black people, for Indigenous people, and for people of color broadly. This history of the transportation planning system has left scars on many communities. And there needs to be a lot of work done to truly shift towards people-centric planning. But the transportation research community, which is largely white and male-dominated, can do much better. And as myself, as a white woman, I can do much better. And that's my role here in trying to host this as a white woman. It feels like, should I be even hosting this? But we all have to do our part here. And part of my role here is to get out of my comfort zone and try to do this work. There needs to be a lot of work done. And we as a community can listen and research in a way that can help inform policy. So the goal of today's conversation is to do that, to listen to ideas about how to do quantitative and qualitative information, to use quantitative and qualitative information to address historic inequalities that Black and Brown people experience every day. So I'm here to listen, and I encourage everyone in this audience to really have an open mind to get through this. So we'll have a simple structure to our discussion, touching on why we need data, what the problems are, and how we can do better. So I'm sorry I've gone on for so long, but I think it's really important to ground our conversation in that introduction. So the first question I'll be asking our panelists, and I'll remind you that our structure is not to have long presentations. We're going to have a Q&A. So I'll be asking the panelists a first open-ended question to just introduce this topic. So why do we need transportation research and data? And what does it have to do with equity? What's the point of collecting transportation data at all? So I'll encourage our panelists to really draw upon their experiences in this difficult moment. Of course, we've got so much going on. And so I'll turn it over to Adonia first.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? I know Lorna has been having issues hearing everybody, so I bet Lorna can't hear me, but hopefully everybody else can. Good to be joining this conversation. So with my background coming from cultural anthropology, the way that I learned to approach transportation, I think is pretty different from how folks who are trained in transportation research and transportation planning approach the topic. So what I'm going to say, I just want to, preface is really informed by that I'm someone who has learned about this field mainly through speaking to practitioners, not through going through the training process myself. But what I've seen is that there are a lot of ways that the structure of transportation research and the kinds of knowledge that are considered to be data within that process, it's very shaped by the same kinds of factors that we know are playing a role in our public spaces in terms of, who has access to privilege and mobility and who experiences oppression and mobility. So not just the transportation systems themselves, the built environment, but also the field reflects those kinds of realities because of, our legacy of historic racial segregation and inequity in this country. So what I've seen studying mobility and studying street culture and street spaces is that there is no way that we can design our streets in a way that is going to shut out racism and sexism and classism and all these ways that we as a society learn to act that values some groups and devalues other groups. It's really not a design question alone. It really has to do with the fact that, depending on the kind of body that we travel in, we're experiencing street spaces in different ways, and we're experiencing mobility systems in different ways. And so what I have found, you know, kind of like understanding street spaces in that way, that they're very locally defined, that they're very influenced by culture and social attitudes, came through the approach to data that I was trained in my field, which is using ethnography. And ethnography in anthropology and other social sciences is a method that has to do with spending time with people. Another way to describe it is as participant observation. So being in spaces where the people you want to learn about are living and doing their everyday routines, talking to them about those everyday routines, and getting a sense yourself by being in the space and, you know, practicing in your own body to whatever extent is feasible or ethical, what it is that people are doing. So that's how I understand transportation and mobility systems and streets. What I've learned over the years in talking to practitioners in transportation research is that the core understanding of mobility and streets that they get in y'all's discipline is really defined by there being built systems for transportation and mobility that are produced by and maintained by a transportation industry, or really like a broad set of industries. And in a lot of ways, transportation research is an industrial science. It's something that developed in tandem with the creation of these built systems. And so I think the starting point for transportation research oftentimes isn't community experiences or the lived realities on the ground. It is, you know, questions that have to do with how do you make transportation systems run more efficiently? How do you expand them? And questions that are more native to the, you know, industrial approach. And I have definitely seen in recent years that there has been a lot of discussion around equity in transportation spaces. But I would say thus far what I've witnessed is more of a, you know, a much needed, but limited awareness that built systems have placed the burden of harm on low-income communities, on communities of color, in urban spaces. But what I haven't seen yet, and what I actually feel really hopeful about in this moment, is that we can push for a deeper dive into really questioning, you know, what is it that transportation research aims to achieve? What does it mean to have roots in industrial development, given the vast awareness, you know, that people now have about the damage that comes from approaches that privilege industry over other aspects of society, and what can be done to actually pivot and do transportation research in a way that starts with the lived experience of marginalized communities. And you know, I think it's incredible to be alive right now at a time when the Black Lives Matter movement is taking things in a direction that is opening new pathways, I think, for a lot of people. So I think I'll stop there.
Great, and I'll turn it over to Warren next to address the question about why do we need data?
Yeah, you know, thank you, Molly, and really, Adonia, I want to lift up your voice again. Thank you for sharing that, you know, really important information. You know, I work in the mayor's office now, and I think one of the main reasons we rely on good data, objective data, is ostensibly to make objective decisions. You know, each day we get a number of phone calls and emails and smoke signals telling us, you know, what to do right now. And I think one of the major reasons why we rely on, you know, research and data is to make sound policy decisions. By that same token, though, I recognize that it is not uncommon that the data that we're collecting, and I've seen this across many of the cities I've worked in, is not as intersectional as it needs to. And so I'll lift up, for example, our bicycle master plan that is not just a discussion around, you know, bicycle infrastructure or about the ways in which people travel across the city, but to your point, Adonia, the lived experience that people are sharing with us as they move through space. And so one of the things that, you know, our mission, especially from OakDOT's standpoint, and frankly from the city of Oakland standpoint, is to make sure that we're asking the right questions out of the research that we're conducting. And in fact, allowing the community to share with us the kinds of questions that they want us to be asking of them so that we're following their stories. I'll share another instance here, though, is that I want to make sure that even though transportation planning, and by extension, governments especially, have shifted towards objective statistical data, right, we shouldn't use that as an opportunity to then silence voices that are, minority groups, people of color, et cetera. And I've seen that happen before. And again, lifting up Adonia's point, one of my major critiques of this like grand shift is I think it's an opportunity, unfortunately, to stop listening to people and saying, well, I hear you, but let's go to the data, right? Let's mine the data and avoid actually having real conversations. And so I always want to make sure to encourage folks to, yes, get reasonable data, make sure that you've crossed your T's and dotted your I's of sorts, but that you shouldn't be afraid to go and talk to someone, to live in their shoes for a moment, and to understand what their lived experience is. And lastly, I'll share that, and I think we'll talk about this a bit today, is that I think the role of a transportation planner especially has focused exactly to your point, Adonia, like the system, the transportation system as an organism that is somehow outside of the realm of like public experience, right? The lived experience. And I had a really good friend in graduate school share with me that, we're taught in some ways that the most efficient bus route is one with no stops, right? That it is most efficient, most effective, stays on its headways, doesn't have any congestion, right? If it doesn't stop. But when you intersect that statement with someone's lived experience, there's no one on that bus. And so how do we marry these two things together to make sure that we're ultimately not just making an effective or efficient system, but that we're thinking about the people of which it's supposed to serve? And I think I'll end there and just express my enthusiasm for participating on this panel.
Sorry, we'll turn to Regina now. Excuse me.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for having me here. It's just wonderful to be part of this conversation, and I'm glad to see some different perspectives that are presented. In answering the question, why do we need transportation research and data? I am partially biased by my former academic experience, but I think that the question of access to data is so fundamental for transportation consulting firms and illustrious academic institutions like UC Davis to have access to data so that they can conduct this independent research that helps us understand critically important problems. That includes climate change, which disproportionately affects communities of color. That includes congestion, and it also includes transportation equity directly. As Adonia has highlighted, I think one of the core biases in our industry is that it isn't particularly representative of the citizens that city departments of transportation and other transportation public agencies are supposed to serve. And my lens of the world at Populus in my role is that we've seen that cities have had much more ability to move more quickly, to adapt to what is, I think, a more rapidly changing world with the introduction of new mobility services. What we want to ensure is that we don't make the same mistakes of the past, where we've delivered transportation services that serve only a few and not everyone. And with new mobility services continuing to arrive in cities, such as Uber, Lyft, micromobility, what many cities have been able to do with access to better data is better plan for those services. They're able to better design equity programs that help ensure that those services are actually accessible to more people. They are actually able to allocate parking for them, more safe infrastructure for them. And so I'm optimistic that there is a strong role for data to play to help ensure that we are actually driving progress towards the outcomes that we want. And I think one of the big critical challenges that we have as an industry is to ensure that we have more voices at the table and in key decision-making roles to help ensure that these services are actually available and equitably shared with everyone.
Great. Thank you, Regina. And finally, we'll turn to Juan to address this question on why do we need data in our communities?
Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate this conversation and the perspectives already learning and thinking a lot. So research is at its core the systematic investigation and the pursuit of knowledge. I think the question in transportation research is about what knowledge, and I think Adonia, her point about transportation as an industrial science is true. A lot of the questions that we answer in research projects inform how to spend public money on transportation infrastructure and operations. And so that does lead to a bias that's on the infrastructure and the objects, the vehicles often, in operating for those objects. And from a research perspective, that's somewhat convenient to focus on the infrastructure and the objects rather than the people. The infrastructure and the objects are less complex than people. And the other work does focus on travel behavior, but this work often falls short of understanding somebody's full experience in public space. It's how they're using it for certain journeys, parts of their day, and then some correlation with demographic information. And I'd say that these reductionist quantitative approaches to researching infrastructure and objects makes transportation phenomena easier to explain to others and to publish for academics, but social systems are very complex, and I appreciate the anthropological perspective from ethnographic research. And that's one of many new approaches, or a few new approaches that I think are needed to be mainstreamed in transportation research. I think the field has to recognize that transportation is always the intersection between these relatively simple infrastructure systems, which can have complicated components. A vehicle can be complicated, a bridge can be complicated, but they're never as complex as social systems. And part of the deindustrialization of transportation research would involve a greater focus on people and communities and use of these alternate, these methods that are less frequently utilized in transportation.
Yes, yes. It's all fantastic points. I think it's really, it's a complex picture we have here. So I think this was addressed a little bit, but I'd like to dig deeper into this idea that, data collection can result in gaps in our understanding. And that's where a lot of the harm, and inequities have occurred, where there's big blind spots from transportation planners. So I'd love our panelists to begin to unpack some of those blind spots, and discuss data collection how it could be causing harm, especially for people of color and for low-income households. So I'll start with Warren. Do you want to address this issue of data gaps?
Absolutely, and I think I touched on this a little bit in my introduction. I think that now working for the government almost 10 years, which feels like 20, I think that we're trained in the government. I think that research is similar, and feel free to disagree with me all, that we're very good at asking the question for which we want an answer to. And what I mean by that is, when I think about, for example, the management of rights of way, or then kind of to your point, Juan, about, identifying where to spend our tax dollars, our resources, right? When I look at a bicycle master plan, I say, okay, it's not uncommon for people to ask, where should we be placing bicycle infrastructure, right? What are the ways in which we can get people to bicycle more? And it's not uncommon then that any type of answer that comes back during any type of public feedback, whether it's a town hall or it's engaging with folks at their local discussion groups, that we're really good at offboarding the kind of information that we don't really want to create space for. And one of the things that I'm really proud of with our Let's Bike Oakland Bicycle Master Plan is that we did exactly opposite of that. We didn't start with, where do I put bike lanes, and I'm going to make sure you really want bike lanes by the end of this process. It's, what does it take to get people to feel safe and secure traveling through Oakland, and is bicycling a tool? And if it isn't, let's unpack all of the different intersections of why that might be. And so there's actually a several page spread about the relationship between policing and stops and bicycling in East Oakland. And so, having participated in too many public meetings, it's not uncommon for someone to say, why aren't you bicycling? And for someone to say, well, you should, look into all of the police data. And for planners to say, I'm not a police officer, I'm going to leave that to the police. And I think that that's one of the things that all of us need to take ownership of, is that it is actually our responsibility to look into that kind of intersection, because we're not doing our jobs if we're ignoring the way that people's lived experience is answering the questions that we're trying to ask, even if we're not doing it a very good way. So one of the things that we found in that plan was that there is a significant, like really significant correlation between geography of stops by police for people riding bicycles and whether they are Black or brown, like overwhelmingly. And that's something that has nothing to do with infrastructure or capital improvements, which is primarily, you know, the type of plan that you would see when you think about a bicycle plan. And so that really spelled out for us, for example, that there are types of gaps that we need to start filling by asking better questions. And frankly, I think as we've all sort of shared, listening better, just having more open conversations and dialogue with community members in spaces that they feel safe and that they themselves have sort of convened on their own and we're participating in, instead of you're coming to my meeting, you're going to answer my 2 questions and anything else is in a box to be, you know, sorted later. So I just want to use that as an example of a way that like we're trying to identify the gaps and be open to community members telling us like how they're really feeling about an environment or their experience, and then trying to address them with the different tools, I think especially from an interdepartmental and intergovernmental standpoint. Because I think this is the other component I'll share in terms of gaps in data or information, is that we work as transportation planners, we work as architects, we work as police, and we rarely allow overlap between these industries when in fact, people's lived experience doesn't work like that. I don't, you know, hop on a bus and say, okay, I'm now a bus rider and everything else I'm experiencing is totally different. There's so many other aspects that I'm bringing to the table or to the bus or the bike or whatever that should be captured in that research. And then ideally to make better policy in my case, or to better infrastructure, or even just better environments.
And before we move on, I just want to also underscore, you had mentioned something, or I've heard about also Oakland doing some data collection related to COVID-19, targeting specific communities and addressing gaps. So do you want to speak a little bit to that before we move on?
I can, sure. And you know, it's funny, during COVID-19, just as quick background, a lot of the city's leadership sort of gets plucked out of their home agency or department and placed into an emergency response team. So I now have 2 jobs. I work for the mayor's office and I'm in our resident support group for, you know, COVID-19 response. And one of the things that we found was, as you know, one of the managers of our testing program, is that we don't even have very good data on people's access to, you know, resources in their communities. And as we're growing to find out that that we're placing these testing sites throughout the city, asking them deeper conversations, again, as I was pointing out before, what is it going to take to get you a COVID test? We first thought, okay, we need to just make the test available in their neighborhood and that will, you know, fix the problem. And it helped part of the way, right? Like access is certainly an issue, but having these richer conversations, as many of us have pointed out, you know, come to realize that a lot of people understandably distrust the government, distrust health systems, and distrust, you know, even sometimes public information. And again, having those rich conversations, sometimes with people as you're passing by them on the street, might highlight that, for example, a group of people feel that the COVID tests are a way to implant something in your brain. And while you and I might think that that's ridiculous, you cannot dismiss that, because that is also a data point. And even though, and I think this is the part that government, and perhaps even my experience with some researchers, not you guys, you're great, is that we sometimes don't allow for even the most ridiculous answers to have light, to have air, and to understand, like, why is it that you would share with me something that I can't relate to, something that I don't understand, something that I would normally dismiss, right? And to think, okay, why would someone believe that this test, right, this COVID test that could save their life, is actually something that might kill them, that's something that might be, that they need to not trust, and really break down those barriers, because that's where the rest of our work has gone, is to, you know, understand then, how do I have the right messenger, right, to not only collect the right data, but then also share the right information back. And that's a really critical component when we think about data and we think about data collection as well, is who's asking the question, whether or not they can be trusted to even share that rich lived experience in a way that is going to be, you know, digested and thought about, not dismissively, but really thoughtfully.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that insights. It's really, really interesting. So I'm going to turn to Adonia here. Can you address this question of data gaps? I know it's an important one.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'll try to say something as smart as Warren. I really appreciate that he's able to bring in his on-the-ground experience with this conversation. So, in terms of data collection and gaps in understanding, again, I think that there is this. Okay, so I've been engaged in conversations for a number of years around, quantitative versus qualitative data and the kinds of questions you can ask, and then the very, real issue that even when qualitative data is being gathered, it's not necessarily fed into decision-making processes in a way that is legible. I've definitely been part of teams where a planning firm is overseeing the collection of qualitative data, but then it doesn't go into the analysis process because they don't know what to do with it. So that's a real consideration. Qualitative versus quantitative, different things that you can get. But I think when we're talking about data collection, we actually need to even go deeper and look at how are these questions, how are these research projects even being designed? And are they making certain kinds of assumptions around what mobility challenges a community is facing and what possible solutions are out there? So for example, I have been asked many times in the last few years to provide review or advice around micromobility projects. And what I have witnessed through the development of that industry is that it's an industry. There are a growing number of businesses who provide those kinds of services in cities, and they're interested in being able to provide more of those services. Now, I don't want to say that there's something inherently bad with businesses being formed and wanting to expand and grow. Obviously, that's part of our, approach to things here in the good old US of A. But what I have found is that usually when a graduate student reaches out to me and is working on a micromobility project, usually there's an assumption built in pretty far back in the research process that micromobility is a solution that a particular community needs. And honestly, I mean, just based on what I've seen from being in conversation with folks who are working more on environmental justice and, the history of racial and social inequities in cities, it's really not very polite to suggest that micromobility is the thing that stands between marginalized communities and, a chance to succeed in America. Somebody said in the chat box earlier, something about how cars don't have, the impact of cars is not the same across all communities. And, just to give an example of how we as researchers also shape, we bring our perspectives to the field we're looking at. I got into being part of transportation work as a very rabid car-free bicycle advocate. I hated taking rides in cars. I was offended when people offered me rides. And over the years, I've had to recognize that, my motivations for having that kind of strong reaction to car culture may actually, I think there's value in those motivations, but to associate all of my concerns about, ecological disaster, environmental injustice, just, wasteful attitudes in general with the private automobile actually erases a lot of the value that people have gotten out of private cars. And they're such a double-edged sword. They enabled our, grandparents and great-grandparents to move into segregated neighborhoods and build the kind of divides that we're now trying to dismantle in our culture. They also enabled people from low-income communities to be able to get to work. And let me tell you, here in Los Angeles, where you are, if you're a working person, you're living on the edge between having a place to live and not having a place to live. I don't think giving up that private automobile, is as simple as wanting to reduce carbon emissions, that might be where you're living, you know, depending on how your next few months go. So just as an example, you know, I had to really question my perspective as a car-free enthusiast in order to better understand the meaning of something like, you know, a private automobile or these different modes within marginalized communities. And so to have so much research money being invested in basically testing how these industrial developments work in urban communities, there's, I think, some reflection that needs to happen further back in the process to see how to bring community members themselves into the research design process and really allow people to define their transportation challenges in their own terms, rather than coming to them with solutions that have been created in contexts that, you know, don't reflect the kinds of pressures that they're living with.
Adonia, it's
and I saw somebody say I was breaking up. Did my audio get better? Yeah? Okay, cool. Sorry.
Adonia, I was just going to share really quickly. It sounds like you're saying we are confronting it as a solution in search of a problem instead of the other way around.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Juan, I'll bring you into this conversation. So would you like to address this question?
Yeah, I think the budget for research is often included in these larger projects or service deployments, or they're bundled together. So the data is too often collected for the evaluation of a specific program or project because that's what's funding the evaluation. So do we need a bike lane here? How are people using this bike share system? And these surveys are never capturing the complexity of social systems, and they're always reducing experiences to what the survey designer thought they needed to know. And there's often a lot of projection from somebody who's involved in the project on their preferences, their values. And I think there's a need to, at the local level, budget and conduct regular surveying of the multiple issues facing individuals, households, and neighborhoods. So not just mobility, but also food access, job security, park access, policing, health. And these would be longer surveys that may involve compensating people to take the survey, but from those you'll get a much more complete picture from which you can have a framework for hanging these other surveys on more specific issues, corridor surveys, to understand how what you learn from one of those surveys intersects with people, their full selves.
Right, absolutely. Just widening our expanding the type of questions we'd be asking, I think it's a good starting place there. So I'd like to turn to a really important issue, which is the issue of privacy. And of course, you could have a whole webinar on this topic. So appreciating that. I'd like to discuss privacy issues related to, specifically to, a question came up from the audience, and this is something we've discussed prior, but you know, the ACLU is suing the city of LA, and Regina has some insights on this. So Regina, I'll turn to you, and I know you're following this closely, and I'd love to, first it might be useful to share what's happening, and then what you think needs to happen in the future.
Yeah, sure. This is a really complex topic. I mean, I think, as you mentioned, we could spend an entire webinar, and I have been on entire webinars focused on this topic, but I think for folks who aren't familiar with the issue, there is a mobility data standard that was developed called the Mobility Data Specification. And what it allows is for cities to be able to more easily access data from private mobility operators. It's mostly been implemented for dockless bikes and scooters. Populus is a company that ingests this type of data on behalf of many cities so that they can use it for transportation, policy, and planning and program management. So there are a couple of, large policy activities that are moving forward in California, most likely in other states. We mostly monitor what's happening in California, being a California-based company and having more insights here. But also there was a lawsuit brought by Uber and Jump Bikes with LADOT, and then the ACLU now with LADOT. And the key challenge, I think, that we need to keep in mind, and Warren brought up this issue, is that there are people who do not trust the government. There are people who do not trust the police. And there are people who would consider the evolution of MDS to be supporting the creation of a surveillance state. So that's kind of where that concern comes from. The key thing, I think, about MDS in particular and mobility data broadly is that geolocation data under GDPR, the privacy policy in Europe, and then also the new privacy policies in California are considered personal information. Geolocation data can be used to re-identify specific individuals. I can say that from our perspective, what we've seen is that there are quite a few cities that didn't necessarily establish privacy policies or specifically data and information security policies that made it clear what the process might be for instance, whether or not the police could wander over to a bike share manager and successfully get data on micromobility trips so that they could use that information to start investigating what they considered suspicious individuals. So I think that's where the concern comes from. This is one of the reasons why I've always thought that having a secure third party is the most efficient option for cities to get both the benefit of having access to data that is really important and valuable for ensuring, the creation of more safe infrastructure, for example, for cycling, for pickups and drop-offs, so we can reduce conflicts between modes, so that we can answer questions about who is being served and who is not being served by new services. But also, we need to address some of the real issues that people are concerned about as it relates to this data being shared and being more widely available.
Right. And, I think that issues around privacy are going to continue. And I think there's much to be discussed in that topic. Juan put in the chat a article that he wrote on this topic of that I mentioned in the beginning, mobility data for policy and planning research. So that paper does address this issue of privacy. And I think for the interest of time, we'll move on, because like I said, we could really spend our whole time talking about privacy issues. And we do want to continue talking about other topics. So the next question I think we'll address together is this question of what we can do. So what are the solutions that we can bring to bear here to improve equitability using good data? What are our opportunities here, and what can these experts? So I'll turn back to Regina first to speak to this sort of the role of data collection in addressing equity issues.
Yeah, happy to dive in here. I mean, I really appreciate everyone's thoughtful responses, and I completely agree with everyone on a lot of the issues related to data and how we can do better. I think that, I actually come from a background of being in a transportation and engineering systems program that really valued qualitative as well as quantitative data. Coming from academia, I also know that a lot of people in the space like to refer to engineering as a hard science, and everything that's not engineering or math as a soft science. And I feel like what's really important as we think about transportation planning and policy is that all of this data is valuable. This data, different qualitative data and different quantitative data answer different questions. I think that as coming from Populus and the work that we do with cities, we have found a lot of value in a quantitative data that is being gathered from mobility services to help plan for safer infrastructure, more sustainable infrastructure, and more equitable infrastructure. That being said, I think it's critically important that we continue to have conversations with people and actually ask people, why aren't they using certain services? Are they not being served by certain services? Because without that perspective, you can't actually make progress. The quantitative data can only get you so far, so it's important to continue to have community engagement, qualitative surveys that gather data that is actually being used in the planning process. And so I think there's a lot of work to do, but I think I'm optimistic there's a lot of progress being made today.
Yeah, absolutely. Turning to Warren, do you want to address this question as well?
Absolutely.
About how we can do better?
I do. So I look at answering this in a couple of ways. So the first of which, and I think we sort of danced around this a little bit, is the way to address, I think, both the gaps in data and what we should do to do better is to put Black and brown people at the center of the discussion, to say, you ask the questions that we should be helping you answer. right? Like that's part of the thing. And I think, Juan, you made a really good point here that we package together research and, you know, capital improvements or other larger programs. So the research itself is already biased to get a specific type of answer. And I think that that's part of the challenge there, right? If I have a capital improvement for a bikeway network, I'm going to ask about how you feel about a bikeway network, not so much about how you feel about mobility, and then what are the different challenges that I can help address, you know, similar to, I think, what you've shared, Regina. I think the second component comes in with training, and this is something that I've shared a couple of times throughout, you know, the different webinars I've participated in, is that it is a privilege to understand how to engage with government. And by extension, I think government needs to do away, and by extension, I would say even, excuse me, research also from an academic standpoint asks very challenging questions sometimes to community groups, especially the ones that we ostensibly are trying to help. And if we're not getting the kind of answers we're looking for, again, we dismiss it instead of coaching people and helping them, you know, have a dialogue and get to the heart of the issue that we're trying to discuss. I've found even with our Slow Streets engagement that, you know, when we were reaching out to Deep East Oakland residents, their first impression was, stop this, don't do any more of this Slow Street program. And I was like, okay, we need to push back and understand what it is that they're trying to get at with this discussion, right? Because at first glance, if we just asked and said, shall we continue or not? And they said no, that's not actually the answer that they're providing, because now a month in with a richer dialogue, they're shared with us that mostly their hangup was about engagement with police. Are we going to be cited for walking in the street? We're scared, we're distrustful of this program and its relationship to other triggering, you know, challenges that we've seen with the government, right? And so that's again where you have to dig deeper into the data. The third issue, and I'm so proud that our engagement officer in the mayor's office sort of discovered this, is that we've worked with the census of all groups to do what's called the Great Oakland Check-In. We called specific zip codes that we knew were hardest hit by COVID. And instead of asking them, like, tell us about your experience with COVID, we just called and checked in on them. Hey, how's it going? We have a couple questions for you. We just want to understand what life is like. And then we're going to go back in and understand and unpack all the different themes that we've heard of, so that the next time we design our programs, the next time we engage with you, we already have a good baseline of the different intersections, again, that I've shared before, of how you're thinking about your well-being in this time and place and during this pandemic, so that, again, we're asking the right questions coming back and ideally developing stronger policies and stronger potentially infrastructure or programs based, again, on those lived rich experiences. So again, that's, you know, putting Black and brown people at the center of the problem identification, training people to ask the right questions, and then finally doing a broader discussion or engagement up front to just understand the ways people think about these different subjects before diving in too deep into one specific subject.
Great. Really interesting. I'll turn now to Adonia. Do you want to address this issue of how we can improve our efforts here?
Sure, yeah. So everything Warren said, which is excellent. And I want to add on, just like emphasizing the importance of looking for guidance from Black-led and people of color-led mobility projects in communities. So something, you know, that was really in my face as the uprising began in Los Angeles was, I'm not Black, I'm a non-Black person of color. I'm a Chicana, Latina, mixed race, mestiza, blah, 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 but I'm not Black. I'm very aware of that. And I was like so ready to start talking about how abolishing the police would work in transportation and then the mobility justice conversations that I'm part of. But you know who was pretty busy were my Black collaborators, because they're dealing with the disproportionate burden of a pandemic. And so all of the Black-led mobility projects I'm connected with in LA were already doing COVID response work. They were doing food distribution. They were helping with testing centers. They couldn't drop everything and come advise, you know, the transportation and mobility people. So I just really think the lack of investment in these projects is just, that's where we need to start right now. So up in the Bay Area, there is Rich City Rides, which is a worker-owned cooperative that's Black-led. Here in LA, we have the Ride On Bike Shop and Co-op, which is a worker cooperative and is Black-owned. There are fantastic community ride clubs that have been around for quite a while. Red Bike and Green in Oakland got started by a Black woman, I think back in 2006 or 2007. In LA, we have the East Side Riders Bicycle Club, which has always had a focus on Black and Brown unity. These groups are there. They've managed to make it despite not fitting the bill of what, you know, transportation research looks at or the kinds of, you know, investments that are being made. And we need to invest in them right now. And then we can actually get to a place where the community capacity is there to help design what, you know, transportation research could look like in these communities. So there's that piece. Invest in the Black-led projects that are out there. Decolonizing research is hugely important. I'm really fortunate to have a great co-thinker in Dr. Sarah McCullough, who is the Associate Director of the Feminist Research Institute at UC Davis. And Sarah said that I could share information about a project called Asking Different Questions that she has been at the helm of facilitating. And I'm going to put in the chat box here a link to this Asking Different Questions overview, and looking for how we've been shaped, all of us have been shaped by the history of colonial land grabs, saying this kind of knowledge is valid, this kind of knowledge isn't valid. Doing that kind of excavation within the field of transportation research, I think, can be really helpful.
Great. Yes, all of those things. And I'll turn now to Juan to address this question of how we can improve our efforts here.
Yeah, I appreciate what Warren and Adonia said. I think just internally within a research institution, we're thinking about what anti-racism means for our mission. We're looking at defining racism as one of the most pressing issues in transportation and developing a research equity statement for our entire research community, 80+ faculty, on what anti-racism would mean in their work, what we expect from the proposals, and what kind of projects we fund in the future.
All right, way to be concise, Juan, because we've got 10 minutes left and we want to take some audience Q&A. So we have a number of questions about this concept of intersectionality, bunch of nerds out there. But I would like to sort of address that question. So this idea of the use of different types of data. So Warren made this fantastic point of looking at bike and police data. Do other folks or does anyone have any examples of where we see the opportunities to intersect different topics better? I think that, like has been said, the researchers, if we don't have these ideas about where the intersections are, they can't do the research, right? So help us find where these intersections are. Where should we be looking? I know it's a tough question. Sorry. Anyone would like to take it?
I can start by saying, and this is kind of the way that Oakland has started transforming its Department of Transportation, is like, instead of starting with we just show up to the conversation. Again, kind of looking at the different planning documents that we've had in the last 3 years now, we start by listening. A lot of our planning documents start from, here's what we heard and now what we're going to do about it, versus we started with a solution and now we're going to figure out if people agree with that solution. We also, and I think sort of touching on Juan's point again, we try and get a lot of the different projects that we're working on to share the research, to share the relationships, so that we have an ongoing conversation with the different advocacy groups, the different community stakeholders, so that it's not just a transactional relationship. I'm coming here to ask you these 3 questions and then I'm gone again. It's, and Slow Streets has really taught us this as well in a, hyper way, is that we have weekly check-in calls now with every single one of our advocacy leads in East Oakland. It started as just a discussion about Slow Streets, but it has very quickly bled into, how's it going? What else are you working on? Can we give you resources that, can we connect you with other folks that are in the city, and that we're basically bringing them into the team. And so I bring that up as a way to think about intersectional research as well, and intersectional data, is that if you bring in the right people up front, they're going to help you ask those questions. So it's not just like, dear white people, please learn how to ask intersectional questions. It's, dear white people, go find people of color to help you ask better questions. Instead of doing the research for us, help us share our own stories. And I think that is a very critical message that I think especially white urbanism has to sort of take hold of is like, it's not your job to just do this alone, because it's kind of what got us here in the first place. Bring us to the forefront, help us lead this conversation, and take a back seat sometimes, listen. That is, I think, the clear message about this as well.
Can I ask I'm just curious, I want to jump in and ask more in a follow-on question, if I may. I think that one of the things that makes me really nervous about COVID and this time is I fear that a lot of voices that already weren't heard are going to be less heard because we can't have those in-person interactions. You can't easily go to those community groups. They can't participate in public meetings that might have been held in the past. I guess I'm curious what your perspectives are on that, and anyone else on the panel, what other cities are doing to really effectively engage in this weird world.
You know, it's funny that you should say that, Regina, because I feel like I'm getting a much better sense of what the community's voice is, because frankly, you know, I've said this since the beginning of my career in city planning. I don't like the way that city planners do public engagement. It's not even engagement, it's outreach or information, right? Most cities, sorry, calm down, Warren. Most cities rely on this sort of like public forum that honestly brings out the worst in people. And it makes you be like rivalrous over the subject. You show up and share your 2 minutes, and this is like everything I've ever experienced in this tiny little compressed soundbite. And the person who's about to vote on the dais, you know, whether it's a city council or commission, they've already decided on the issue. So at this point, you're kind of just wasting your time. And I'm just going to be honest about that. Sorry for the people who probably don't want to hear that. But one of the things that's been really exciting during COVID is that it almost has leveled the playing field a little bit, because you can't show up to my office and yell at me or my staff. You actually have to find new ways to engage with us. And so the mayors had weekly town halls, something that actually our team has decided might be something to move forward with even beyond COVID. Maybe not weekly because it's a lot of work, but we find that we're having much better conversations with stakeholders because we can connect at times that otherwise we wouldn't feel comfortable traveling across the city, you know, sitting in a difficult meeting room, you know. And I think a lot of folks who are on these Zoom calls, they've got their baby in one hand and they're cooking the other, but they're actually able to still engage in the conversation instead of having to find daycare, having to get snacks, and bringing the whole kit and caboodle to a meeting. That is, I think, the really exciting thing about COVID is that there are no excuses now to not being able to listen to people because we're all using a lot of the same technology. That said, there is a big digital divide that we're still not addressing, right? Like, not everyone has the internet, not everyone has a cell phone, not everyone has a laptop, and perhaps most importantly, not everyone has high-speed internet to do Zoom calls to have these interactions. So our engagement team has been kind of going gangbusters about all of the different ways to get the message out and receive feedback. So for Flex Streets, which is our like open streets, you know, business resilience program, all the flyers now say text Flex to like a 6-digit number, and it will feed you the different survey questions. And then at the end, I think is one like, tell us whatever you want about this program. What are you thinking? Are you comfortable? And most people at least have like SMS texting. So we're really like, just not to use this term, but blowing up all the different ways that we can engage with people to make sure that there are no excuses for why we didn't hear your voice during this time. So I kind of push back, not on you, Regina, but on folks who would say, oh, you know, I can't possibly find ways to engage with people now that they can't show up to my office. It's like, really? Like, we have so many options that we could be tapping into right now, and frankly, should have been tapping into a long time ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And during our webinar last month, we had an example from an organization called Sela in Southeast Los Angeles, where they were using WhatsApp to reach out to individuals, and found that it was more successful than so you just have to think of new ideas.
Have had thousands of people on them. Sorry to cut you off, Molly, but that's the funny thing, right? Like, no one city hall meeting has ever had 3,000 people on it, right?
Right.
Like, so it might be completely different people, but at this point, to go back to what we were doing is almost like a terrible idea, because if you just look at the numbers, we're reaching way more people this way.
That's awesome to hear.
Yeah, great. Well, I think we have just a couple of minutes left, so I'd love to give everyone an opportunity just to make a really final comment here. So, Regina, I'll turn it to you to just make just any final thoughts you have on this topic, and then we'll close it.
Well, I think my final thoughts are I just really appreciate the opportunity to be part of the conversation. I think that there are a lot of us in the transportation community in research and in planning who have so much to learn on transportation equity and how we can do better. So those are really my final thoughts. I'm just glad to be part of the conversation and would love for Warren to start his own YouTube channel because I'd watch it every day.
Heck yeah. All right. I'll turn to Juan. So do you have any final thoughts?
I think it's important to know when to follow and know when to lead. So at UCLA ITS, we're going to be doing a combination of those things, but we are really seeing our role as a transportation research center as something that can help implement some of these ideas we've discussed on this webinar today.
Great. And Adonia, take us home. Final thought.
Yeah, I would love to, hear from the different institutes that have been putting on this series, what is being done to push, I told the folks in this panelist group yesterday when we were planning this call that, for me, the three revolutions have been a very alienating concept because they really seem to be coming from a place that's disconnected from the hardship that working communities face with automation, with being shut out of these new kinds of industries that unfortunately carry a lot of labor exploitation into their development. So I would so love to hear from ITS and the Three Revolutions folks, how they're engaging with the Just Transition Framework. It's really easy to find if you're not familiar with it. Just Google Just Transition Framework and you'll see how, folks, particularly here in California, are working really hard to move us toward an economy that is regenerative and takes everybody into account so that we're not talking about having a revolution that leaves a whole lot of folks behind. So I would so love to see that. I know you all have the resources and the leadership. Please take this opportunity to point toward to real change.
Wow, and I really thank you so much for that because to hear that the Three Revolutions is an alienating frame it kind of made it made me uncomfortable, but I think that's okay, and I appreciate you calling that out, and I think we will make a commitment to making it more to pushing more justice into the conversation. So I really encourage us to continue this conversation, and it's really eye-opening. So I really appreciate that, and I think we'll have to end it there. Of course, there's so much more to discuss, and I'll once again share that we will have another. Once again, thank you so much to our panelists. You really you're bringing so much wisdom and experience to this forum, and we really appreciate you being here. So, and reminder, we do have a webinar. Our next one will be on July 15th at 1 p.m. and it will be lessons from some of our pandemic research surveys. So that will be an opportunity where we can really we can continue this conversation about data, but in a very different way. So please join us for that. Thank you to our audience for joining in, and we hope you can get out there and fight for a just, equitable, and climate resilient future. So thank you so much, and goodbye. We'll sign off.